I sat in the courtroom watching my brother Colin hand a thick folder to Judge Morrison. "Your Honor, these medical documents clearly show that our father, in his sound judgment, declared only me fit to manage his estate and healthcare decisions." Colin's voice was smooth, confident, practiced. My heart hammered against my ribs as Judge Morrison flipped through the pages, his reading glasses perched on his nose. This couldn't be happening. 3 weeks ago, my father had been gardening, complaining about the weather, making jokes about getting old. Now Colin was presenting documents claiming Dad was mentally incapacitated and had signed over everything to him alone. The judge looked up from the papers, his expression grave. "These appear to be properly executed medical evaluations and power of attorney documents. Based on this evidence, I'm prepared to grant temporary full control to Mr. Colin Harper pending further review." The words hit me like a physical blow. My vision blurred. My hands gripped the edge of the table in front of me. Judge Morrison turned his attention to me, his gaze piercing. "Ms. Harper, do you have any reason to believe these documents are fraudulent?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Everyone in the courtroom waited for my answer. My mouth went dry. I struggled to form words, feeling completely ambushed by Colin's presentation. He'd given me no warning about these documents, no opportunity to review them, no chance to consult with my own attorney. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware these evaluations had been conducted," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "My father's health decline was very recent and very rapid. I'm not sure when he would have." Judge Morrison raised his hand, stopping me. "Do you have evidence of fraud, or are you simply disagreeing with your father's stated wishes?" I looked at Colin. He sat at the defendant's table with a slight smirk playing at his lips, like he owned not just the courtroom but the entire situation. Like he'd already won. My name was Jessica Harper, and until this moment, I'd thought I knew exactly who my brother was. We'd grown up together in the same house, shared the same childhood memories, sat at the same dinner table for 32 years. But the man sitting across from me, looking so smugly satisfied, was a stranger. A dangerous stranger who'd somehow stolen our father's autonomy and was now claiming legal authority over everything Dad had built in his 73 years of life. 2 months earlier, everything had been normal. Dad lived independently in the house where Colin and I grew up, a modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood. He had mild memory slips occasionally, forgetting where he'd put his keys or repeating a story he'd already told. Nothing severe. Nothing that suggested he couldn't manage his own affairs. Then Colin started insisting Dad needed round-the-clock oversight. He began showing up at the house daily, sometimes multiple times. He'd call me with urgent concerns about Dad forgetting to take vitamins or leaving a light on overnight. "He's declining faster than you realize," Colin told me over the phone one evening. "We need to be proactive about his care." "Dad seems fine to me," I'd replied. "A little forgetful, but nothing alarming." "That's because you don't see him every day like I do." Colin's tone had been patronizing. "I'm the one actually taking responsibility here." He started making medical appointments without consulting me, despite the fact that Dad's will designated both of us as co-decision makers. When I questioned this, Colin said he was just being efficient. One afternoon, I visited Dad and found him sitting at the kitchen table, looking confused and upset. "Something's wrong," he whispered to me, glancing toward the hallway where Colin was on the phone. "But I can't remember what." The following week, I tried to schedule my own appointment with Dad's primary physician, Dr. Whitmore. I'd known Dr. Whitmore for years and wanted to get an honest assessment of Dad's cognitive state. The receptionist's response stopped me cold. "I'm sorry, Ms. Harper, but you're no longer authorized to access your father's medical records or schedule appointments on his behalf." I gripped my phone tighter. "What? Since when?" "The authorization was updated last week. Only Colin Harper is listed now as the designated healthcare representative." My stomach dropped. "Who changed the authorization?" "I can't discuss those details. You'd need to speak with the authorized party." I drove straight to Dr. Whitmore's office, hoping to straighten out the confusion in person. But when I arrived, the same receptionist looked at me with genuine sympathy and repeated that her hands were tied. Your brother already picked up all the files, she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Complete medical history, recent evaluations, everything. He said he needed them for estate planning purposes. I stood there in the waiting room, surrounded by outdated magazines and the smell of antiseptic, realizing that Colin had been systematically cutting me out of Dad's care. The question was why? What was he planning that required my exclusion? 3 days later, Colin called requesting a family meeting. He arrived at Dad's house with a leather portfolio and an expression of somber responsibility. Dad sat in his recliner, looking tired and confused. Colin pulled out a document and laid it on the coffee table. "I've had Dad's attorney draft an updated will," he announced. "Given his declining health, we need to make sure everything is in order." I picked up the document, scanning the legal language. My blood ran cold. The new will named Colin as sole trustee of Dad's estate, sole executor, and sole beneficiary of the family home and primary assets. I received a token $5,000. "This isn't what Dad wanted," I said, looking at my father. "You told me you wanted everything split equally between Colin and me." Dad's face scrunched in concentration. I don't remember. Colin said this was important. For taxes or something." "This has nothing to do with taxes," I turned to Colin. "This completely changes Dad's estate plan. When did this happen?" Colin's expression remained calm. "Dad signed it the same day he signed the competency evaluation with Dr. Patterson. Everything was done properly, witnessed by a notary, completely legal." The document looked too polished, too professionally formatted, too recent. Dad's signature at the bottom looked shaky, uncertain. Nothing like his usual bold script. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation, Colin's smooth explanations, Dad's confused acceptance. Something was fundamentally wrong, but I couldn't quite grasp what. Around 2 a.m., I remembered Dad had left me a voicemail weeks earlier that I'd been too busy to return. I found my phone and scrolled back through old messages. When I pressed play, my father's voice filled my quiet bedroom. "Jess. He's rushing me. Papers everywhere. Too fast. I keep asking him to slow down, but he says we have to." The message was dated 3 weeks ago, when Colin first started his aggressive involvement in Dad's care. "I don't understand all these forms. Legal language. Medical evaluations. He says it's all necessary, but I don't know, sweetheart. Something doesn't feel right." My chest tightened. This was Dad before Colin had completely isolated him. Dad still aware enough to feel confused and concerned. The message continued. "Maybe you could come over and help me understand what I'm signing?" Colin gets impatient when I ask questions. He says I'm being difficult, that I should just trust him, but a loud bang interrupted Dad's words. Then Colin's voice, sharp and commanding, "Dad, you need to focus. We don't have time for phone calls right now." The message ended abruptly. I played it 3 more times, my hands shaking. I confronted Colin the next morning at Dad's house. He was in the kitchen making coffee like he lived there, like he owned the place already. "Why have you been isolating Dad from me?" I demanded. "Why did you remove me from his medical authorization? Why are you rushing him through legal documents?" Colin laughed, actually laughed, like my concerns were childish. "You're being emotional, Jessica. As usual. Someone needs to handle Dad's affairs responsibly, and clearly that someone isn't you. Dad wanted both of us involved. That's what his original will stated. Dad's not capable of managing these decisions anymore. He needs someone decisive. Someone who understands finances and healthcare. Not someone who shows up occasionally and gets sentimental." The gaslighting was subtle but unmistakable, making me doubt my own observations, my own judgment, my own relationship with our father. "I talk to Dad every week," I said. "I visit regularly. You're the one who suddenly appeared and took over everything." Colin set down his coffee mug with deliberate precision. "Listen carefully, Jessica. Dad trusts me to handle this. The doctors agree he needs oversight. The legal documents are all properly executed. If you try to fight me, you'll only embarrass yourself and upset Dad in his final months. The threat was clear. Back off, or face consequences. His final months? I repeated. What are you talking about? Dr. Whitmore said Dad could live another decade with proper care. Later that week, I visited Mrs. Alden, Dad's neighbor for over 20 years. She lived in the house next door and had always kept a friendly eye on our father. Jessica, dear, I'm so glad you stopped by, she said, inviting me in for tea. I've been worried about your father. She settled into her armchair, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. Colin's been bringing people to the house at odd hours. Medical-looking folks with clipboards. Sometimes late evening, sometimes very early morning. My attention sharpened. What kind of people? Professional types. I saw a van once that said something about mobile medical services. Colin would escort them inside, they'd stay maybe an hour, then leave with paperwork. Mrs. Alden's face creased with concern. One time about 3 weeks ago, I was gardening and saw your father answer the door. He looked confused, Jessica. Almost frightened. He kept shaking his head, but Colin put his hand on his shoulder and guided him back inside. Did you see what company the van was from? I wrote it down, actually. Seemed unusual enough to note. She retrieved a small notebook from her side table and flipped through pages. Here it is. Premier Mobile Medical Consultants. The van had a phone number too. She handed me the page. I photographed it with my phone, my mind racing with possibilities. 2 days later, an envelope appeared under my apartment door. No return address, no postage, just my name written in block letters. Inside were photocopies of medical forms, the same ones I'd been denied access to at Dr. Whitmore's office. Someone had slipped me copies of Dad's supposedly confidential records. I spread the documents across my dining table, examining each page carefully. The signatures looked wrong. Shaky, inconsistent, like someone had traced them uncertainly. Some forms showed Dad's signature slanting right, others left. The pressure varied wildly from one document to another. But what stopped me cold was a form dated March 15th. According to my own records, Dad had been hospitalized on March 14th for a minor procedure. He'd been under sedation until March 16th, barely conscious, unable to hold a conversation, much less sign legal documents. Yet here was a competency evaluation supposedly conducted on March 15th, with Dad's signature at the bottom, declaring him mentally sound enough to make his own decisions while simultaneously agreeing to transfer all decision-making authority to Colin. The contradiction was glaring. I photographed every page, then put the originals in a safe deposit box. Someone had risked their job to get me these copies. I needed to honor that risk by using them wisely. I managed to schedule a brief meeting with Dr. Whitmore's physician assistant, a kind woman named Tanya who'd always been friendly to our family. We met for coffee at a shop far from the medical office. I could lose my job for talking to you, Tanya said nervously, stirring her latte. But something felt off about the whole situation. What do you mean? The sudden flood of evaluation requests, all from Colin. The insistence on specific dates and times. The pressure to rush everything through. Tanya glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Dr. Whitmore was uncomfortable with it too, but Colin brought in this outside consultant who supposedly had special expertise in geriatric competency assessments. Do you remember the consultant's name? No, but I remember thinking his credentials looked unusual. Not our usual referral network. She took a breath, then leaned closer. Jessica, check page 3 of the neurological examination. The one dated March 15th. What's on page 3? Just look carefully. That's all I can say. She stood abruptly, leaving her half-finished coffee. I was never here. We never spoke. I sat alone at the coffee shop, pulling up the photos on my phone. I found the neurological examination and zoomed in on page 3. And there it was, a timestamp error that changed everything. The form indicated the examination had been conducted at 10:42 p.m. on March 15th. But Dr. Whitmore's clinic closed at 6 p.m. every day. There was no way a legitimate examination could have occurred at that time. It was proof. Undeniable proof that something was fundamentally wrong with these documents. I immediately contacted a handwriting analyst recommended by a colleague. Walter Chong had 30 years of experience testifying in court cases involving document fraud. I can give you a preliminary assessment based on copies, Walter explained during our phone consultation. But for definitive analysis, I'll need the original documents. I sent him high-resolution scans of the signatures I'd obtained. 2 days later, he called back. Miss Harper, there's probable inconsistency between the signatures on older documents versus the recent ones. The baseline characteristics don't match. Pressure patterns, letter formation, flow, they're different. Can you testify to that in court? With the originals, yes. The variations suggest either significant neurological deterioration, which would contradict the competency evaluations, or simulation of the signature by another party. I needed those originals. They were supposedly in Colin's possession, locked away in Dad's house where I was no longer welcome. The next day, I drove to the house to attempt a visit with Dad. Colin met me at the door, blocking my entry. "You're disturbing our father," he said coldly. "You need to leave. I just want to see him for 10 minutes. Not today. Not until you accept the legal reality of the situation." I hired an attorney, a small-town estate lawyer named Thomas Crawford who had a reputation for uncovering paperwork fraud. Thomas was in his 60s, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Your brother's in deep," Thomas said after reviewing everything I'd brought him. "And he's been reckless. That's good for us. Reckless people make mistakes." He spent 3 days examining the documents, cross-referencing dates, checking credentials, verifying notary stamps. On the 4th day, he called me into his office with barely contained excitement. "Jessica, look at this." He pointed to the notary stamp on several key documents. This notary, Bernard Kowalski, supposedly witnessed and stamped these forms last month. Right so. Bernard Kowalski moved to Arizona 3 years ago. I called him personally. He's been retired since then and hasn't notarized a document in over 2 years. My breath caught. Someone forged the notary stamp? That's exactly what happened. And that's a criminal offense, not just a civil matter. Thomas started pulling together a case file. "We need to file an emergency challenge to Colin's authority. But I want to be thorough. Let me dig a little more." Over the next week, Thomas uncovered the trail. The mobile medical consultant Colin had hired wasn't licensed in our state. Premier Mobile Medical Consultants wasn't even a registered business. It was essentially one person operating under a made-up company name. Through Thomas's legal channels, I was finally granted a supervised visit with Dad. A social worker accompanied me to ensure the visit was appropriate and non-disturbing, as Colin had insisted. Dad sat in his favorite chair, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Jess," he whispered, his voice breaking. I told him no. I kept telling him no. Why won't anyone listen to me? I knelt beside his chair, taking his frail hands in mine. "I'm listening now, Dad. Tell me what happened." He brought papers. So many papers. Said I had to sign them for my own protection. Said you didn't want to be bothered with taking care of me. His hands trembled. I said I wanted you involved, that we'd always planned to share decisions. But he said you told him you didn't have time, that you'd moved on with your life. The manipulation was sickening. Colin had isolated Dad emotionally by lying about me while simultaneously cutting me out of the process entirely. "Dad, I never said any of that. I've been trying to see you for weeks, but Colin won't let me in." I thought something was wrong. The signatures felt wrong. But he kept saying I was confused, that I was forgetting things. Dad fumbled in his cardigan pocket and pulled out a crumpled note. "I wrote this down before I forgot. So I'd remember." I unfolded the note. In Dad's shaky handwriting, he lied. Thomas Crawford filed an emergency petition to challenge Colin's authority and request an immediate hearing. The petition outlined every discrepancy we'd found: the forged notary stamp, the impossible timestamp, the unlicensed consultant, the signature inconsistencies. Judge Morrison granted the emergency hearing for the following week. When Colin received the petition, he called me, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You're making a huge mistake, Jessica. Dragging our family through court, embarrassing Dad, wasting money on lawyers. Someone forged documents, Colin. Someone lied about Dad's condition and manipulated him into signing away his autonomy. You can't prove any of that." "Actually, we can. Thomas has been very thorough." Silence on the other end. "Then, this is going to destroy what's left of our family. You destroyed it when you decided to steal from our father." The hearing date approached. Thomas prepared meticulously, organizing evidence, lining up the handwriting analyst, preparing questions that would expose the fraud. "Your brother will try to explain away each discrepancy individually," Thomas warned me. "Our job is to show the pattern. One mistake might be overlooked. A dozen mistakes in the same direction prove intent." The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Everything depended on the next day. On whether Judge Morrison would see through Colin's lies. On whether justice would prevail over manipulation. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that hummed faintly. Colin sat with his attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who kept whispering strategies. Thomas sat beside me, calm and focused, his weathered briefcase open on the table. Judge Morrison entered, and we all stood. He was in his late 50s, with a reputation for being thorough and intolerant of deception. "Let's begin," Judge Morrison said, settling into his chair. "Mr. Crawford, you've filed an emergency challenge to the power of attorney and estate control granted to Mr. Colin Harper. Present your case." Thomas stood, his voice clear and measured. "Your Honor, we have substantial evidence that the documents granting Colin Harper control over his father's estate and medical decisions were obtained through fraud, forgery, and manipulation of a vulnerable elderly person." Colin's attorney immediately objected. "Your Honor, these are serious accusations with no foundation. My client acted in good faith to protect his father's interests." "We'll see about that," Judge Morrison said. "Mr. Crawford, proceed with your evidence." Thomas began systematically presenting each discrepancy. The notary who'd moved to Arizona. The timestamp showing an evaluation conducted after clinic hours. The signature inconsistencies. The unlicensed consultant. Colin's attorney tried to interrupt, claiming clerical errors and misunderstandings, but Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. Then Thomas called the handwriting analyst to testify. Walter Chong took the stand, his credentials impressive and his demeanor professional. Thomas handed him the original documents, which we'd finally obtained through court order. "Mr. Chong, you've examined both historical signatures from Mr. Harper Sr. and the recent signatures on these contested documents. What's your professional opinion?" Walter adjusted his glasses, holding up two documents side by side. "The signatures are inconsistent in multiple measurable ways. Baseline slant, pressure patterns, letter formation, connecting strokes, all show significant variation. Could this variation be due to the signer's declining health or cognitive function? If that were the case, we'd see deterioration in motor control, shakiness, incomplete letters, trailing strokes. Instead, we see deliberate, careful simulation. Someone attempting to recreate the signature while looking at an example. In your expert opinion, are these signatures authentic?" "No. These signatures are simulations. Not authentic autographs from the same individual who signed the earlier documents." The courtroom went silent. Colin's face had gone pale. His attorney shuffled papers frantically, trying to formulate a response. Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Harper, these are serious findings. Do you have an explanation for this expert's testimony?" Colin's attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, we dispute this analysis. Handwriting analysis is subjective and—" "Mr. Chong has testified in over 200 cases," Judge Morrison interrupted. "His credentials are impeccable. I want to hear from your client directly. Mr. Colin Harper, do you have an explanation?" Colin stood slowly, his earlier confidence completely gone. Your Honor, there must be some mistake. My father signed all these documents willingly. I was there. I witnessed it. Who else witnessed these signatures? Judge Morrison asked, flipping through the documents. The notary, Bernard Kowalski, according to these stamps. Mr. Kowalski, who moved to Arizona 3 years ago and hasn't notarized a document since then? The judge's voice was sharp. Colin stammered. I don't know about that. I hired a notary service. They sent someone. I assumed it was legitimate. You assumed. Judge Morrison's skepticism was obvious. Tell me about this medical consultant. Premier Mobile Medical Consultants. Who are they? A specialist in geriatric competency evaluations. Someone recommended them. Who recommended them? I don't recall exactly. A colleague, maybe. Thomas stood. Your Honor, Premier Mobile Medical Consultants isn't a registered business in this state. The individual operating under that name isn't licensed to practice medicine here. We have documentation proving this. Judge Morrison's expression darkened. Mr. Harper, did you verify this consultant's credentials before having him evaluate your father? I trusted the recommendation, Colin said weakly. Your Honor, if I may, Thomas interjected. We'd like to present testimony from Mrs. Eleanor Alden, Mr. Harper Sr.'s neighbor, regarding unusual activities at the residence during this period. Mrs. Alden was called to the stand. She testified about the odd hours, the mobile medical van, seeing my father looking confused and frightened. As the evidence mounted, Colin's attorney tried desperately to redirect. Your Honor, even if there were irregularities in the process, my client was acting in what he believed were his father's best interests. Best interests? Judge Morrison's tone was incredulous. By hiring unlicensed consultants? By using forged notary stamps? By presenting fraudulent medical evaluations to this court? We believe those are clerical errors, administrative mistakes, not intentional fraud. Thomas stood again. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence a recording that demonstrates Mr. Colin Harper's true intentions. He played the recording I'd made during our confrontation, Colin's voice clear and damning. Dad didn't know what he was doing anyway. He was confused. That's why I had to take control. The judge listened to the entire recording, his face growing sterner with each word. When it finished, he looked directly at Colin. Mr. Harper, you just heard yourself admit that your father was confused, yet you presented documents to this court claiming he was mentally competent to sign over control of his entire estate. Which is it? Colin opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his attorney desperately. It's complicated. He had good days and bad days. Convenient how all the good days happened to coincide with signing documents that benefited you exclusively, Judge Morrison observed dryly. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Mr. Harper, let me ask you something very specific. You claim your father was evaluated on March 15th by this mobile consultant. Can you tell me who exactly examined him that day? Colin fumbled with his papers. The consultant from Premier Mobile Medical. His name was... I have it here somewhere. The examination supposedly took place at 10:42 p.m., Judge Morrison said, reading from the document. Where did this examination occur? At my father's home. That's why we used a mobile service. And Dr. Whitmore's clinic, where the form header indicates the examination was conducted, closes at 6 p.m. daily. How do you explain the timestamp? Colin's face reddened. That must be an error. A mistake on the form. A mistake that happens to make the document appear official and clinic-sanctioned when it was actually conducted by an unlicensed individual at your father's home late at night? Whispers rippled through the small courtroom. I glanced at Dad, who sat with a court-appointed advocate, looking confused but hopeful. Judge Morrison continued. Furthermore, this examination allegedly occurred while your father was hospitalized and under sedation. Hospital records show he wasn't discharged until March 16th. How could he have been evaluated at home on March 15th? Colin had no answer. His attorney looked equally stunned, clearly realizing his client had lied to him. "Your Honor," the attorney said weakly, "we may need to request a continuance to review." "No," Judge Morrison interrupted firmly. "We're going to resolve this today. I want the original documents submitted for forensic examination." Walter Chong, still on the stand, was given the original documents. He examined them under a specialized light, using magnification tools he'd brought. The courtroom waited in tense silence. After 15 minutes, Walter looked up. "Your Honor, under magnification, I can confirm these signatures show clear evidence of simulation. The ink shows hesitation marks where the forger paused to check their work. The pressure is inconsistent with natural signing. Additionally, some signatures show evidence of tracing, microscopic indentations suggesting a template was used." He pointed to specific examples, explaining the technical details in terms the court could understand. "These signatures are definitely not authentic. They were created by someone attempting to replicate Mr. Harper Sr.'s handwriting." Colin had turned from pale to gray. He gripped the edge of the defendant's table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Judge Morrison addressed him directly. "Mr. Harper, in light of this expert testimony, the forged notary stamp, the unlicensed consultant, the impossible timestamps, and your own recorded admission, do you have anything to say?" Colin's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, probably advising him to remain silent. But Colin, perhaps realizing the full weight of his actions, spoke quietly. "I just wanted to protect the estate. To make sure it stayed in the family. Jessica has never been responsible with money. Dad was getting confused, and I thought, you thought you'd manipulate your elderly father, forge documents, and defraud the court." Judge Morrison's voice was ice. "Your Honor, please, enough." Judge Morrison took a moment, reviewing his notes, then looked up with an expression of barely controlled anger. "Mr. Colin Harper, what you've done here isn't just unethical, it's criminal. You've forged legal documents, used fraudulent notary stamps, hired unlicensed individuals to pose as medical professionals, and presented false evidence to this court." Colin's head dropped. His attorney sat frozen, probably calculating how to distance himself from this disaster. "This court finds that all documents allegedly signed by Mr. Harper Sr. after February 1 of this year are invalid due to fraud and forgery. The original will and power of attorney designations are hereby reinstated." Relief flooded through me so intensely I almost gasped. Thomas put a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "Colin Harper's authority over his father's estate, medical decisions, and personal affairs is suspended immediately and permanently. He is barred from any financial or medical decision-making regarding his father." Colin's attorney tried one last time. "Your Honor, if we could request—" "I'm not finished," Judge Morrison said sharply. "Mr. Harper, you will face civil penalties for the fraud you've committed. I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges. You will also be responsible for all court costs and attorney fees for both sides." I stayed calm, looking at my father rather than Colin. Dad was crying quietly, the advocate beside him offering tissues and comfort. This court appoints Jessica Harper as temporary guardian and trustee of her father's estate pending a full competency evaluation by a court-approved medical team. As the courtroom began to clear, Thomas gathered his materials with quiet satisfaction. "The missing piece just arrived," he said, showing me an email on his phone. "The so-called medical consultant has been found." The consultant, whose real name was Troy Mansfield, had been fired from a similar position in another state for misconduct. He'd been operating under various company names, providing questionable medical evaluations for a fee. "He's provided a statement," Thomas continued. "He admits Colin contacted him specifically requesting evaluations that would support a competency claim. He admits he never actually examined your father properly and that Colin coached him on what to write." "Will he testify?" "He already has. In a sworn affidavit. He's cooperating fully, probably hoping for leniency." The statement outlined how Colin had paid Mansfield $15,000 in cash to create official-looking medical evaluations without conducting proper examinations. How Colin had provided Mansfield with templates and specific language to use. How Colin had pressured him to backdate documents and falsify timestamps. It was comprehensive confession that removed any remaining doubt about Colin's intentions. Judge Morrison had already received the statement, which explained his especially harsh rulings. "This seals it," Thomas said. "Your father's estate is safe. Colin won't be able to touch it." I looked across the courtroom where Colin sat alone, his attorney having left immediately after the ruling. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of his crimes. The final hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. By then, a court-approved medical team had evaluated Dad thoroughly and determined he had mild cognitive impairment but was capable of understanding his affairs with proper support. The team recommended a co-guardianship structure with oversight, exactly what Dad's original planning had envisioned. The courtroom was fuller this time. News of the case had spread through our community. Elder fraud was a serious issue, and Judge Morrison had indicated this case would serve as an example. The judge entered, and we all stood. He reviewed the medical team's findings, the complete investigation results, and the district attorney's preliminary recommendations. "This case represents a troubling betrayal of trust," Judge Morrison began. "Mr. Colin Harper systematically manipulated his vulnerable father, forged legal documents, and attempted to defraud both his father and this court. He outlined every inconsistency, every lie, every forged detail methodically. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I sat quietly, holding Dad's hand. He was more alert today, more present, finally free from Colin's isolation and manipulation. Based on the comprehensive evidence, this court makes the following permanent orders," Judge Morrison announced. "Jessica Harper is appointed legal guardian and trustee of her father's estate and medical decisions. The original will is reinstated in full. All documents signed after February 1st are void and unenforceable." He turned to Colin. "Mr. Colin Harper, you are permanently barred from any role in your father's care or estate management. You will pay restitution of $32,000 covering legal fees, court costs, and financial damages. You will serve 200 hours of community service and face 2 years of probation." Colin didn't go to prison, but he faced full accountability. The civil penalties were significant, and the criminal probation meant any future misconduct would result in jail time. The judge's public rebuke had been scathing and thorough. Local news covered the case, using it as a warning about elder financial abuse. Colin's reputation in the community was destroyed. His employer, learning of the fraud conviction, terminated his position. After the final ruling, as people filed out of the courtroom, Colin approached me in the hallway. His expensive suit looked rumpled now, his confident demeanor completely gone. "Jessica," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I stopped, though part of me wanted to keep walking. "What is there to say, Colin? I know I can't fix this. I know you'll never forgive me. But I need you to understand, I only did it to secure my future. The company was downsizing. I had debts. The estate seemed like the solution. So you stole from our father. I was going to take care of him. He would have had the best care, the best facility. He wanted to stay in his own home. He wanted both his children involved in his life. He wanted the family to stay together." I looked at my brother, this person I'd grown up with, and felt only sadness. "You could have asked for help. You could have been honest about your financial problems. We could have worked something out as a family." Colin's eyes filled with tears. "I was ashamed. I didn't want you to know I'd failed. You always had everything together, and I was drowning. So instead of asking your sister for help, you decided to defraud your father and destroy our family?" He had no answer to that. The logic of his choices was indefensible, no matter how he tried to justify them. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what it's worth, I'm truly sorry. You should be apologizing to Dad, not me. He's the one you betrayed most." Colin nodded miserably. "He won't see me. The court advocate said he gets agitated when my name is mentioned." "Can you blame him?" I started to walk away, then paused. "You know what the saddest part is, Colin? You could have kept your family. We would have helped you through financial trouble. We would have supported you. But you chose greed and deception over trust and love. You chose money over your own father. I know, he said, his voice breaking. I know. I walked away from him then, down the courthouse hallway where Dad waited with his advocate.